Welcome back to the book club. I'm Michael Knowles. This month we are going to be talking about Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which is a book that men and boys in particular don't want to read, but is actually one of the greatest novels of all time.
And this is why she's our heroine. She's every bit the heroine of Odysseus or Aeneas or Robinson Crusoe.
It's so full of action, even though nothing really happens.
You know, classic female tools of ostracism and, rumor and all, and put down.
Why? I mean, it seems to be such an affront to modernity. Why on earth do people still read them?
PragerU loves books, but they don't seem to love the words written inside of them. Their regular podcast, the PragerU Book Club, features some of the most inane takes on great works of literature, recontextualized to appeal purely to a conservative audience. One of their earliest episodes focused on one of the most iconic novels ever written, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. And they followed this up by never mentioning Jane Austen ever again. Seems like a big omission for one of the most iconic authors of all time, but what are you going to do? Now, it's not like PragerU never repeats authors. They have 2 separate Shakespeare episodes, 2 separate George Orwell episodes, 2 Ayn Rand episodes, 2 C.S. Lewis episodes, among others. I didn't look at every single episode they ever made to find repeats, but those are the ones that popped out first and foremost. I'm sure there's a couple Aristotle there as well. Nor is it like PragerU can't twist words from marginalized authors to fit a conservative agenda. You may laugh about this, but they have an Oscar Wilde episode. Jane Austen is one of the greatest writers of all time, and on some level, maybe perfect for PragerU, but not for the reasons they probably think. Given how they analyze the work, she's the worst author, other than Oscar Wilde, for PragerU to cover, because it's harder to twist the words if you don't know what you're doing. A few months ago, I did a video on PragerU's book club and learned they love to take the aesthetics of Shakespeare in this case, but not the general body of his work. They deified Shakespeare, tried to make him a moral lesson for its audience, but that's harder to do with Jane Austen, in part because, well, other authors did what Jane Austen did who are just as prolific. The Brontes, the Shelleys, they were women writing literature at that time. But what is it that made Jane Austen so beloved? Her work is defined by sharp wit, well-written characters, and a grounded focus on the interconnected systems of etiquette and commerce that dominated the culture of the Regency. The reason why PragerU might like them is that these are stories that simultaneously uphold systems of control while subtly illustrating how these systems ruin lives. That's both why they might like it, that element of reinforcing the status quo, but the subtle critique is where things fall apart, and if you're not careful with your conservative agenda, you might bump into the idea that, hey, these characters are suffering under the system that is being upheld by the discussions of the novel. That's why you gotta be very careful discussing it from a conservative lens. I do not believe PragerU understands that delicacy, however, so it is going to be very funny. The conflict of Pride and Prejudice exists on 2 interconnected levels. On one hand, the Bennet household is without income and needs one of their daughters to be married off to a wealthy household in order to stay afloat, both to inherit the wealth of Mr. Bennet when he finally passes on, as well as inherit more income for the household. See, Mr. Bennet is a cynical and sarcastic older gentleman who is both very witty and very judgmental, especially with his wife. And because he has no male heirs, when he dies, the fortune will disappear and the family will be turned out onto the streets. Now, there are 5 daughters. In order of birth, you have Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, and Kitty and Lydia. The only ones that matter, of course, in the story are Jane, Elizabeth, and Lydia. But the story is about these 5, well, really 3 girls as they navigate the social theater, with Jane falling in love with the lovely, handsome, and wealthy Mr. Bingley, Elizabeth and Lydia being smitten with the seemingly proper military man Mr. Wickham, Mrs. Bennet trying to pair Elizabeth off with her cousin, the clerical Mr. Collins, the perpetually boring Mr. Collins, more like it, all while dealing with this arrogant jackass named Mr. Darcy, who just seems to be too good for everyone and acts like he's too good for everyone and just is a standoff kind of guy, and Elizabeth can't stand this guy whatsoever. Guess who ends up together? You probably know, this is a very iconic novel. Just about every single romantic comedy, to some extent, has lifted from Pride and Prejudice. That and Much Ado About Nothing, which is very similar in many ways. The PragerU video shows Michael Knowles talking to Abigail Shrier, a name that should make you immediately cringe if any of your friends were trans on the internet in the 2020s.
I'm joined by Abigail Shrier, a journalist and the author of the upcoming book Irreversible Damage, due out in June from Regnery. Abigail, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Shrier is a Wall Street Journal writer, most famous for her crusade against trans people, hence the reference before. In 2020, around when this episode was recorded, she wrote the book Irreversible Damage, the transgender craze seducing our daughters. This proposes the idea that being trans is some hypnotic social contagion on social media. See if you can see if she's trying to hint at that in this episode. I'm sure it will never come up whatsoever. It's not relevant at all. It's relevant the entire time. The book Irreversible Damage is widely considered as quack psychology, and anyone who's ever legitimately studied the topic knows it's ridiculous, but it is a favorite among right-wing pundits who know nothing about this topic, like Michael Knowles, for example. At this point in time, you're probably wondering how Shrier is remotely qualified to discuss a novel from the Regency era, if she's mostly known for fear-mongering and spreading misinformation. Well, guess what? She isn't. I got nothing else there.
Welcome back to the book club. I'm Michael Knowles. This month we are going to be talking about Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which is a book that men and boys in particular don't want to read, but is actually one of the greatest novels of all time.
That's again a very odd way to frame one of the greatest novels of all time right off the bat. Though I guess it does give a perspective as to who Knowles is talking to. Closed-minded people who don't want to engage with material outside their interests. That being stories about manly men being manly and action-packed. Trust me, he's not subtle about it.
I have to confess, I've read Pride and Prejudice 3 times. First time I read it, I didn't like it. Second time I read it, I still didn't like it. The third time I read it, I loved it. How's that?
It's a work for a mature man. It really is.
Well,
it really
thank you.
is.
You flatter me.
Knowles liking the book more on the third read than the first. I don't want to be petty, because it is a valid thing. Some books do grow on you. Some books mean more to you at different stages of your life than otherwise. But he frames this book as something men just won't enjoy by virtue of it being womanly.
Which is a book that men and boys in particular don't want to read, but is actually one of the greatest novels of all time.
What does that mean? Well, we'll find out, I guess.
Anyone who really wants, to see inside a woman's psyche, to get inside her heart and mind, this is the book to do it. And I think that's the sort of thing that can benefit, everyone.
I want to come back to this perspective later, but that this book is some great insight into the female psyche, because I don't think it really is. Not really, anyway. You see, the primary story is told through Elizabeth's perspective, sure, but the book seldom goes into the heads of the characters. The story will occasionally reposition itself, either through letters written between the characters, or even the first couple of chapters where we see it primarily from Mr. Bennet's perspective, rather than the perspective of Elizabeth, or any of the other daughters for that matter. Mr. Bennet introduces himself and his family to the newly arrived Bingleys, and we see it primarily as a game he plays with his wife.
I am sick of Mr. Bingley.
I'm sorry to hear that. If I'd known as much this morning, I should never have called on him.
Teasing her and mocking her, while simultaneously doing exactly what she hopes to have accomplished. But on his terms, of course. It's amazing how Austen communicates so much character through dialogue over set pieces, or the like. The divide between the interior and exterior selves we present is relevant, of course, since Elizabeth's prejudices towards Darcy's pride prevents Elizabeth both from seeing Darcy's social anxieties and true feelings, but also the deeply good nature of Darcy's person, and the deeply selfish interests of Mr. Wickham.
The novel begins with one of the most famous lines in literature. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters.
I mean, that's what's so amazing about it, right? It's obviously tongue-in-cheek. There's real wisdom in it, too, because there's truth in it. I mean, Jane Austen is full of these nested truths.
The opening line of this novel is very good. It's an iconic moment, and it's very witty. but they really fail to dive into what it means here. Everyone knows a man with cash must want a wife, even if he doesn't, and so everyone needs to swarm in to snatch them up for marriage. Such are the efforts of the Bennet family early on. The irony, of course, is that this plays right into that divide between prejudices and pride. The prejudices of all the people color the situation, no matter what the target says, or what affections they actually want for that matter.
Look, this is the story of the 5 Bennet girls and their family, and they are facing calamity in the countryside of England. And the calamity is that their estate has been entailed through the male line, which means the property rules governing their estate mean that it can only be inherited by males in their family. So they're about to lose, when their father dies, they will lose their house, they will lose everything. And they are facing poverty in 19th century England. They're facing, we're talking about nothing like we could imagine today: starvation, disease, early death. So they are up against formidable odds, and the only person really in a position to save them is Elizabeth Bennet. And she does it through her wit, her intelligence, her deep moral sensitivity and thoughtfulness, and her thoroughgoing rationality.
Okay, I don't really like how Shrier frames Elizabeth as the hero of the story, because she really isn't.
And this is why she's our heroine. She's every bit the heroine of Odysseus or Aeneas or Robinson Crusoe. But what she battles, of course, her theater is not war, right? But it's a different sort of war. It's a war in the English countryside of balls and homes, in which she must fight for the opportunity to secure her family through marriage.
She's the protagonist, yeah, and technically, while her actions do lead to the story's resolution, the daughter who saves the family from poverty is and always was Jane.
So Elizabeth Bennet is the second eldest of the daughters. The eldest is Jane. She's the most beautiful. She's like the prom queen. And Elizabeth is a little tougher.
Right. She's the most judgmental.
Most prejudiced.
Right. I don't know if I'd call her the prom queen, because Jane is actually very deep as well and has a lot of wisdom. What she has is a lot of acceptance and forbearance. She really is willing to roll with what life hands her. Mm-hmm. Elizabeth very much is not.
Jane and Bingley are the far more traditional good moral people in the narrative. Neither have any significant character flaws other than being a bit naive. Both people are good and are influenced by those who are more strongly defined characters who are more cynical in nature, like Elizabeth and Darcy. This reduction to just focus on Elizabeth only reduces the value of Elizabeth Bennet. She isn't actively trying to solve the family's problems. If that were her intent, she'd marry Mr. Collins. But she doesn't. See, Mr. Collins is set up as a potential savior for the Bennet family. Someone who will marry any of the daughters and save them from poverty when Mr. Bennet passes on. He'll marry anyone, but he particularly likes Elizabeth. However, Mr. Collins only wants to marry not out of love or desire for himself, but because his patron, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, suggests it. Basically says, you ought to marry. And he's like, yeah, I ought to marry. And then he goes off to get married. He's very simple, that man. But Elizabeth absolutely hates this boring, dull loser, as does Mr. Bennet, who understands that while Elizabeth marrying Mr. Collins might save the fortune of the household, it would make Elizabeth bored out of her mind.
Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins. I will never see you again if you do.
Instead, Collins doesn't marry Elizabeth, but rather Elizabeth's friend Charlotte Lucas, who, already being older and more undesirable by many prospects, accepts to pursue a comfortable life. She doesn't love Mr. Collins, but also she doesn't care. Honestly, their relationship is one of the more interesting ones to see adapted. Either Mr. Collins is maybe good on some level, or Charlotte doesn't care about him, lets him just go about obsessing over Catherine de Bourgh some more, whatever. Good or bad, it depends on how the adapter chooses to adapt it. But anyway, yes, Elizabeth isn't the hero who saves the story and actually deliberately averts ways that she could save the household throughout the book. Because it's not a story defined by conflict, even though conflict informs every action. Elizabeth choosing not to marry someone boring carries more weight because of the greater conflict of the story. It does not, however, determine the outcome of events. Besides, Lydia gets married before anyone else does anyway, but we'll get to that later because that almost brings ruination to the family. Don't worry, we'll get there.
And this is why she's our heroine. She's every bit the heroine of Odysseus or Aeneas or Robinson Crusoe.
The comparison between Elizabeth and Odysseus only exists to imply this book is good for boys, whatever that means.
But what she battles, of course, her theater is not war, right? But it's a different sort of war. It's a war in the English countryside of balls and homes in which she must fight for the opportunity to secure her family through marriage.
This is a war as opposed to just a complicated narrative, because I guess the audience can't handle it if there's no sword fights.
Because she's got this, you might say, nagging mother. The mother has the best interests of her daughter, I think, somewhere at heart, which is she's trying to marry off her daughter. She's constantly trying to encourage the daughters to get married. She's got this sort of absent father who indulges his daughters. He's not paying close attention.
Let's talk a second about Mrs. Bennet, actually. There is a great debate as to what Mrs. Bennet's nature is. I always saw her as an extrapolation of her youngest daughters, one driven by society's expectations to marry, by the desire to become wed. Does Mrs. Bennet have Elizabeth's best interests in mind when pushing her to marry Mr. Collins? Or is she interested in protecting her family's estate? Or is she just romantic, who wants people to be married regardless of what they may want themselves? Well, it's hard to say. Clearly, Mr. Bennet is no saint either, as he consistently mocks and ridicules his youngest 3 children, while paying Jane, and especially Elizabeth, extra attention and care. This is something I actually prefer about the 2005 adaptation with Keira Knightley a lot, because it shows the Bennet parents being far more loving to the entire family. It makes Mrs. Bennet less annoying and irritating, and makes Mr. Bennet seem like less of a distant, detached man. There are even moments of tenderness between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, which I quite like in that adaptation. Now, unsurprisingly, Knowles heaps praise on Mrs. Bennet for following society's expectations without considering her daughter's intentions, and he criticizes Mr. Bennet for being asleep at the wheel. Shrier insults both.
She's saddled with a fool for a mother, an ineffectual and distant father, and she has to save the entire family. And she does.
And never do we note how Elizabeth's wits are directly inherited from her father, nor how Lydia's foolishness is a direct trait from her mother, and how both bring about bad things for the household. Rather, Lydia will be blamed later on, but none of the things Elizabeth does that brings misfortune are mentioned, especially not Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins is almost completely forgotten from this discussion, as is Wickham, but we'll get there.
It's funny, in certain ways the book seems archaic, right? We don't go to balls anymore, and you think, well, women aren't judged in this way. Well, anyone who would say that really isn't paying attention, of course, because of course they are. There's a ball that never ends, and we call it social media.
I find it odd how they say that the book is antiquated because of the presence of balls. I mean, we have parties nowadays. We have gatherings, get-togethers, social outings. That's not archaic. But to compare the balls of the Regency era to a modern-day institution of social media is, well, it's interesting. Because Shrier argues that social media spreads social contagions in other works, like Irreversible Damage, the book she's promoting. Don't forget, it's all promotion for a book.
And the author of the upcoming book, Irreversible Damage, due out in June.
Still, she focuses on the negatives of social media, how the balls can be a place for social gossip. Except Caroline Bingley is the example she cites, and Caroline Bingley is an exception.
Of course they are. There's a ball that never ends, and we call it social media. And and Caroline Bingley always shows up. You can never escape her. We know what she thinks because she tells all your friends.
So Caroline Bingley
she's
is the sister of this rich guy.
And she's mean.
And she's cruel.
She's an outsider of the community who comes in. She doesn't like the balls. She dismisses them as poor people's parties. The balls are seen as social events for the community. They're not continual gossip trains, which would better describe the obsessive gossip that drives younger Bennet girls and Mrs. Bennet to do what they do. I'm starting to think Shrier isn't qualified to discuss the Regency era if she acts like balls are the equivalent of social media.
She's cruel, and she makes, right, and in this game for social status and social acceptance, she is devastating, and she fights with all the, classic female tools of...
Classic female tools. That's a loaded statement, isn't it?
classic female tools of ostracism and, rumor and all, and put downs of various kinds and social slights.
Wickham also uses rumor and gossip to get his way, to an incredibly worse extent than Caroline Bingley, who just mainly uses gossip to condescend to those around her. But she has very little impact over the course of the story. Mr. Darcy's younger sister also doesn't seem to tolerate Caroline Bingley's gossip, despite them all being from the same social class. And in fact, Elizabeth clocks Caroline Bingley for what she is almost immediately. She's ultimately an extension of the pride that Darcy exhibits in context of how the plot functions. The only difference is that Caroline pretends to be kind, but is purely arrogant below the surface, while Darcy appears to be arrogant, but is truly kind below the surface. They are ultimately foils of each other, and actually, Caroline irritates Darcy if you pick up on the subtlety in the dialogue there. Of course, Elizabeth doesn't see this angle. She just sees two rich people being arrogant. But it helps validate Elizabeth's prejudices against the whole lot of them, save for the kindly Mr. Bingley, who stands out by comparison. But it's clear what Shrier's doing here, right? She's selling Pride and Prejudice to misogynists. No, Elizabeth isn't just a clever woman existing in an unfair system that demands she compromise her happiness for others. No, she's a warrior, fighting for her family, while those stuck-up bitches like Caroline gossip and rant and judge on social media where societal contagion spread. But you're smart, you're capable, you're not gonna let your family down because your father is too inept to save it for you, right? You'll be a real warrior. You see how stupid that sounds? How insincere we're already framing Pride and Prejudice? And we're only a fourth of the way through this, by the way. We're not even close to the worst takes yet. But framing it like this, what does it accomplish? Selling it to those who would already hate the work to begin with.
Well, this is what really got me to start appreciating Pride and Prejudice.
What got you to appreciate Pride and Prejudice, Knowles? What was that?
Is that it is mostly about women. It's about the desires of women and the status of women, but it's so full of action, even though nothing really happens.
It's full of action, despite nothing happening. Jesus Christ, okay. Why is it that it's about women, but also it's full of action? Why are they framed as contradictory statements here, Knowles, huh?
It's so rich in tension and drama and action, but it's about the private lives in this private sphere and dinners and teas and balls of these girls in the English countryside.
This is clearly presented for people who don't want to read stories about characters, Which is already disingenuous, way to look at it. It's not an action story. There's no set piece where they have to save a burning boat or anything. And Mr. Darcy isn't fighting zombies. That's another book.
I mean, that's exactly right? High school boys denigrate it. They say, oh, nothing happens, right? We want the Iliad. We want battles.
Want adventure.
Right, but what are the battles of our lives? Mm-hmm. They're mostly social, right? They're mostly about people who don't like us or don't esteem us or try to keep us out or try to hold us back or try to keep us down. Those are the real battles of the modern life. Mm-hmm. And they're the battles that Elizabeth must fight.
It's only 6 minutes in, and the Iliad and the Odyssey have been referenced more than Mr. Darcy. In a Pride and Prejudice video, Ulysses is more relevant than Darcy. Jesus Christ.
And it's a very serious work in the sense that it's all taking place talking about people's manners and how polite or rude they are and a little biting comment here or there.
Knowles saying the novel is very serious is proof he doesn't get it.
He must truly be in love with her, I think.
You think that, Jane, if it gives you comfort.
There's so much dry wit and sarcasm throughout the entire book.
I'm afraid I'm interrupting your solitary reverie.
You are indeed.
Why a man of sense and education who has lived in the world should be ill qualified to recommend himself to strangers.
How can you read that and not pick up on all the wit?
But really, the novel isn't just about manners. It's about virtue. The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, who wrote another great book called After Virtue, he said that Jane Austen, in Pride and Prejudice and other books, is the last great imaginative voice on the subject of virtue.
So Jane Austen is an advocate for virtue, is that right? Well, this is where we transition, like always with PragerU Book Club, away from what the work actually says to the tools they can use the book for. What have they actually discussed? Everything so far is the first 100 pages, maybe, but now it's a tool to be applied to audiences on how to frame their lives, how fucking wonderful that is.
Everything in this book keeps coming down to virtue. You know, she even says when she's concluding what makes a marriage work, she says, how little of permanent happiness could belong to a couple who were only brought together because their passions were stronger than their virtue.
Hell, Knowles has so little to say about it, he can't find a single example of virtue in the novel before just pointing to the title like an idiot.
This idea of virtue keeps coming back, and I guess it comes back to the very title of the book, which is Pride, the queen of all vices, and how virtue can be contrasted with that.
It's like a high school book report by a student too lazy to cheat, or get an AI summary, or read SparkNotes. Pride isn't dangerous because it's a biblical sin in the story. It's bad because, in the novel, it speaks to the class divide, the economic situations that result in people losing their households. The Bennet family isn't poor, but the Bingleys and Darcys are immensely wealthy, and condescend to those around them. And that condescension, by members of both families, puts into further perspective the desperate financial situation the Bennets are actually in. But on top of that, Pride ends up robbing Jane briefly of happiness. You see, Mr. Darcy's pride convinced him that Jane isn't good for his friend Bingley, and so he convinces Bingley to not move forward with courting Jane. This means Mr. Darcy's actions directly put the entire Bennet family into a situation that's desperate. They may lose their house because Darcy acted impulsively. Now he thinks he's doing it for the benefit of his friend, but it actually almost ruins Bingley's one chance of happiness and the Bennets' chance for financial success. And then the dumbass doesn't see why Elizabeth might not want to go out with him after that. You know, might cause a little bit of an issue in their relationship there, isn't it? It's only when Darcy overcomes his pride that he's able to make things right for the Bennets multiple times over, in part because of Wickham, someone he already dealt with in the past. But that's funny, isn't it? Has the book club even mentioned Wickham yet? I mean, they read that quote about passions and virtues.
She says, how little of permanent happiness could belong to a couple who were only brought together because their passions were stronger than their virtue.
That's ultimately a passage that feeds into the core conflict with Wickham, a virtueless man who acts to satisfy his own selfish wants at the expense of everyone else. Surely, if they're going to talk about virtue, they will discuss Wickham, right? Right? Okay, they do, but very badly.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you know, too often this book is dismissed. I think because it is about things like virtue, it's about human relationships. Oh, who cares about those, right? Yeah. They're only the most defining features of our lives, right? Oh, marriage, that's not a consequential decision, right? Women should care more about what? Their careers?
Did you just imply that it's bad for women to focus on their wants and passions over marriage? Oh, wait, you think passions in that quote means ambitions? No. No. Passions refers to sexual passions. Lust, basically. Not ambitions for their personal satisfaction. They're talking about sex. Elizabeth literally turns down Mr. Collins because he's boring. If personal ambitions were the problem, that would be framed as bad, as opposed to a good thing Elizabeth does. Did you read the book? Because that's kind of an important element. Elizabeth never sacrifices what she wants for anyone else's happiness. She pursues her own happiness because she knows she's worth it. Again, did you read the book?
I mean, what are the things that matter most to us? It's the relationships we have with people. Mm-hmm. That is what makes life worth living, right? I mean, would we admire Elizabeth Bennet more if she spent her life defending the international copyright of Pizza Hut? Is that a better, you know, well, is that more valorous?
That's what modern society says.
Right. That's what modern society says. And how ridiculous is that?
Right.
What she cares about is the things that so many women have cared about for so long and are the most important things, which are love, relationships, marriage, children, all sorts of, you know, virtue. All the things that matter most are the things that so many women have naturally cared about and are too often denigrated today.
At no point in the novel does Elizabeth express any particular interests towards marriage, nor does she ever discuss having children. If anything, Elizabeth would find the copyright issue she just made fun of way more interesting because she likes that kind of stuff. She likes things that are intellectually stimulating. Early on, Elizabeth actually has an anti-interest in marriage. She just wants to make sure Jane's happy, and marriage would make Jane happy, so that's how Elizabeth is interested in that whole topic at all. Her seemingly only chance at getting married is with Mr. Collins, and she rejects it. Doesn't even consider the option. Later on, she admires Mr. Wickham, and this is framed as a mistake, because it's clear Wickham was using Elizabeth as a tool to defend himself from Darcy, and then behave selfishly in other ways.
All the things that matter most are the things that so many women have naturally cared about and are too often denigrated today.
Now, I'm convinced that Shrier has not actually read Pride Prejudice if she thinks this book is a pro-marriage message, when Elizabeth scoffs at her friend Charlotte for marrying Mr. Collins. But no, clearly the system where families can become destitute over your child's gender is better than the modern era, clearly. I'm going to turn into the Joker over a PragerU Book Club reaction to Pride and Prejudice, aren't I? I swear to God.
What's so striking about this, something I think high schoolers often miss, is the centrality of self-knowledge.
I actually really hate how they keep framing it as the book you read in high school. Because do you think so little of your audience? That they only see it as the book you read in high school? Do you have to demean the book you're talking about so much to your audience? They clicked on a video about Jane Austen, about Pride and Prejudice. They're going to want to talk about Pride and Prejudice. Like, if you're watching this video, I assume you have at least a basic interest in either PragerU or Pride and Prejudice. If you've gotten this far especially. Like, it wouldn't be condescending if I kept saying, oh, you know, that boring book you read in high school. Am I right, guys? Am I right, men? You know, have to read that book between, you know, your powerful, awesome shonen manga you read all the time. Like, give me a break, guys. Just talk about the novel. Talk about the events. Talk about what happens in it. This condescension, this anti-intellectualism just frames the book as a chore. And I'm trying to say, no, really, it is worth reading. As opposed to assuming your audience read the book. If you make the book sound interesting to your audience, they'll be interested in it as well. Also, small reoccurring thing, every time Nobles says anything, Shrier goes, that's exactly right. Like, right here, he just reads a line from the book and she goes,
That's exactly right. I mean, that's why we love her. She's not perfect, but the expectations for women that Jane Austen had could not be higher, right? They are absolutely, I mean, we see the fool what happens to her foolish sister who runs off with the first guy who's interested.
Who is not of the best character, you might say, that
best
fella.
Character who has had a poor education and has never managed any kind of self-governance. And Pride and Prejudice takes a very hard stand against that.
Yeah.
It sets very high expectations for these women, and they deliver. I mean, Elizabeth certainly does, and we admire her for that. And with using humor and wit, and a lot of, as you said, self-consciousness, she really succeeds in the end.
Here's interesting off the bat here. First off, they mentioned Wickham without actually saying his name. Curious. I'll take it, but it's curious. But then they discuss the high expectations that women face. This is something directly discussed earlier in the novel, when Jane is driven to illness while visiting Mr. Bingley, and has to stay a few nights to be nursed back to health. This is thanks to Mrs. Bennet making her ride out in the rain on horseback, so she would get sick and would get stuck at the estate, but that's a whole other story.
If Jane should die of this fever, it would be a comfort to know that it was all in pursuit of Mr. Bingley and under your orders.
Elizabeth goes over to visit Jane. She spends some time with the Bingleys, and discussion of women being accomplished comes up.
She must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages to deserve the word.
I never saw such a woman. She would certainly be a fearsome thing to behold.
The aristocracy with Bingley and Darcy expect women to be highly accomplished, knowing multiple instruments, knowing how to sing, knowing poetry by heart. And Elizabeth points out that's a little unrealistic. It's this contrast, the realism versus the high end, that kind of proves women can't possibly live up to the expectations that the higher ups expect everyone to get, especially when, they can pay for trainers to teach everyone that, for tutors. And this refusal to conform is what actually draws Darcy to admire Elizabeth first. But also, him standing by these expectations without publicly chastising them directly is what reinforces Elizabeth's prejudices against him. Ironically, they're pulled in different directions.
Because at this moment where the younger sister, Lydia, who is a flirt, that's how she's described. She always wants to be surrounded by these men and flirting with them, and she runs off with this shady character who on the surface is very charming and nice and seems like an upright guy. And in reality, he's rotten to the core.
He has avoided discussing Wickham this entire time, probably because that might undermine some of his points. Here's why. Wickham is a man who is framed as an authority. He's a soldier, a man who seemingly has been wronged by Mr. Darcy in the past. And he frames this to us very sympathetically. He is charming, until you know the truth.
Elizabeth realizes that she misjudged Mr. Darcy. She misjudged so much of this situation. She prejudged it. She let her pride get in the way, and she says, "How despicably I have acted. I, who have prided myself on my discernment. I, who have valued myself on my abilities, who have often disdained the generous candor of my sister and gratified my vanity in useless or blameless mistrust. How humiliating is this discovery, yet how just a humiliation. Had I been in love, I could not have been more wretchedly blind, but vanity, not love, has been my folly. Pleased with the preference of one and offended by the neglect of the other, on the very beginning of our acquaintance I have courted prepossession and ignorance, and driven reason away where either were concerned. Till this moment, I never knew myself."
That's exactly right. I mean, that's why we love her. She's not perfect.
Now, in context, Elizabeth's quote refers to how blindly she believed the lies Wickham told her, and allowed it to blind her to any good qualities Mr. Darcy had without doing any homework of her own, because she believed Wickham to be of good character due to her pre-existing prejudices, and believed Darcy to be of a scandalous, horrible nature because of her preconceived notions. In short, Austen is telling the reader this: don't trust men in uniform based on the uniform. Judge him by his character. Don't blindly trust military men to be just. Don't trust all talking heads in a suit to know what they're talking about because they look sharp. Don't trust cops to... But there's still time for Wickham to get mentioned, surely, to discuss the depth of his character, surely. What does Elizabeth succeed at in the end?
Yeah.
It sets very high expectations for these women, and they deliver. I mean, Elizabeth certainly does, and we admire her for that, and with using humor and wit and a lot of, as you said, self-consciousness.
Yeah.
She really succeeds in the end.
Really, think about it for a second. She doesn't save the family fortune. Jane does that by marrying Bingley. And Bingley married Jane partially because of Jane's actions and partially because Mr. Darcy walked back on his negative actions earlier in the story. Elizabeth's personal happiness comes after all of that, because that's the real driving factor of the narrative. We like Elizabeth, we want to see Elizabeth be happy in this system that is so restrictive. Now yes, Elizabeth is part of the thing I just discussed. She's instrumental in every aspect of that narrative, but she is ultimately accountable for her own happiness in society, not the happiness of her entire family.
And she runs off with this shady character who on the surface is very charming and nice and seems like an upright guy, and in reality he's rotten to the core.
The superficial way he discusses Wickham is in many ways proof Noel's knowledge of the book is dearly limited, but at least he mentioned Wickham, finally, over halfway through the video.
So they run off together, and the other sister, Mary, who is kind of like the moralizer of the book, she reflects on this and says, "Loss of virtue in a female is irretrievable, that one false step involves her in endless ruin. Her reputation is no less brittle than it is beautiful. She cannot be too much guarded in her behavior toward the undeserving."
But I don't think Jane Austen takes that view.
No.
Right?
This is the prevailing view at the time.
At the time, right.
Now this perspective about Mary is very interesting. Mary Bennet is one of those characters readers respond very differently to her due to their own life experiences. Now I know people who are autistic or socially awkward, they relate to Mary a little bit, and maybe they project a little bit of themselves onto Mary because she is socially awkward. But I think the truth is simpler. Mary is a know-it-all who knows nothing.
You've delighted us long enough. Let the other young ladies have time to exhibit.
She can make quotations all she wants, but ultimately, she just wants to be taken seriously by her own family, who, let's be honest, they're not the best. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet don't care about her. They care about the eldest two and the youngest two, which leaves Mary in the middle. This is one thing I really like about the 2005 adaptation, because it gives Mary a little bit more to do, shows her as more sympathetic than in the book, and does so without compromising her core characteristics. I feel people who really like Mary remember that film more than they remember the novel. Knowles quotes Mary as though her perspective is worth listening to. It's not. And even Shrier dismisses Mary.
So Jane Austen's view is much deeper, I think,
Right.
because Mary's very awkward. She doesn't read social cues. One gets the sense from the beginning she may be an old maid. She really has struggles with people. And she comes across as way too censorious and way not, and certainly not understanding enough.
Before moving on to arguably her most unethical point that you could possibly have made.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, in a certain sense, what you said about Lydia is she's the modern woman, right? She goes to live. She doesn't care about marriage. She's going to run off with a few.
She's going to go shack up with this guy,
she
live
thinks
in
it's
sin.
fine.
Yep.
And the problem is, of course, she's facing the ruination of her dignity, her virtue, and her social status, and really financially of her whole family.
Yeah.
And for a guy who probably will never, in fact, he tells us, will never get around to marrying her. He has no intention of doing so.
No.
But she goes to live with him anyway. This is not, her future is not so bright. And in many ways, she's the modern woman in the book.
Shrier argues that Lydia represents the modern woman because she runs off with a man who doesn't care about marriage. Now, of course, the implication here that Shrier is implying is that Lydia is selfish. Like all modern women, apparently. Don't forget, she wrote Irreversible Damage, which is about modern women, apparently. Except, there's one key issue with all this. A little big thing. No big deal. Lydia thinks Wickham will marry her. Mr. Wickham lures women in with the false pretense of marriage eventually. He tries to pull this with Darcy's sister, and Darcy figures him out, which is why Wickham is so dead set against Darcy. He's exposing his grift. This is also what he pulls on Lydia, who, I remind you, is a child. She's like 15 or something. She's being exploited by a substantially older man who has done this before with other women. And because society at this time, if you're a girl and you have a relationship of wedlock, you're ruining your family, but if you're a man, you get off scot-free. He's allowed to just do it repeatedly. It's another critique of the book that is obvious if you know what you're looking for. The fact that Shrier frames this as Lydia's deliberate selfish action is incredibly disingenuous when the story has established that Wickham is a serial adulterer who grooms much younger women consistently. Much younger girls consistently for relationships. And once he gets what he wants,
do what you need to with her, then broom her fast.
Lydia's actions are ridiculous and self-centered. Yes, but she's a child. And the story places more blame on the factors around her, including on her mother, who raised her to be obsessed with marriage without ever counterbalancing that with the worldly skepticism, arguably worldly cynicism, that Mr. Bennet dows into Elizabeth. It is incredibly clear that PragerU does not see Pride and Prejudice as a work of fiction, but as a tract to enforce the conservative ideology of old is better than new.
And Elizabeth Bennet, who fights for her dignity, who withholds. I mean, imagine if Elizabeth Bennet had hooked up with Darcy when she first met him at the first ball, there'd be no book, right? Because he has no esteem for her in the beginning. He'd have no esteem for her in the end. She wouldn't have won anything. I mean, we all win by withholding.
Jesus Christ, I hate this point too. What's with all your points? They all suck. What if Elizabeth hooked up with Darcy at the start of the book? Well, why would they even want to, right? The book isn't about withholding. Neither party likes the other. It's not a story about holding back. If anything, Darcy withholding his good deeds from the public and being so private actually prevents Elizabeth from falling in love with Darcy. Again, did you read the book? This isn't a story about erotic passions. This is a story about people growing to admire one another. Why bring up desires being withheld at all? That's not a factor at play here.
Yes,
right?
because at the first moment that our two main characters meet, Elizabeth and Darcy, they don't particularly care for one another. Darcy says that Elizabeth's kind of ugly, not that impressive. Elizabeth finds him haughty and prideful and awful. And they both win each other over through these deeds of virtue.
It is bewildering that Noel seemed to understand that Elizabeth and Darcy could never withhold one another's passions, even if he seems to think that Mary's inane babble actually has a point.
You know, it's interesting, even on her sister Mary's point about virtue being lost in a woman, the woman's lost forever. That doesn't seem to be Jane Austen's view.
Yeah.
But Elizabeth does take it seriously enough that they are doing everything they can to win back this sister and not have her become disreputable for the rest of her life.
He tries again. He tries to pull this again, despite Shrier's backlash to the idea. Or do you have tea? I guess I'm almost done filming.
And this is another key difference in the book between appearance and reality. So the appearance of having a lot of virtue and the reality, and really possessing virtue. The appearance of being charming and amiable, but it's often the most charming characters are the most rotten.
Yes. You know, Kitty is facing nothing good. Lydia is facing nothing good. And a lot of the reason is because she's a fool, right? She hasn't really given much thought to the life she wants, she's not a moral agent.
Right.
And Jane Austen wants women to be moral agents, to choose their life, to decide what kind of man they want to end up with, or woman, whoever it may be, and make a decision and go for it. And not by giving in to every whim.
Ultimately, this podcast is less about the book by Jane Austen and more about pushing a book they maybe like onto an audience that might not like it to reinforce an ideology they already all possess. This is in order to establish a sense that books are some great constant and can reinforce society, as well as the idea that their ideas aren't new and contradictory, but actually reinforced by history. Here, literature exists to reinforce their perspective. Many fascists see art like this, a tool rather than human expression to reinforce an ideology. The truth is this: Jane Austen was more focused on how women can exist in society than she was moralizing to her audience. Mary is what you get when someone moralizes, or Mr. Collins, and they're presented as fools. Elizabeth, though, feels real, because she's multifaceted. She's witty, yeah, but her wit is applied to the moment. She's able to apply her thoughts to the here and now. She's one of the best written characters in fiction because she doesn't necessarily have a goal. She's just existing. She's a woman who lives in the Regency era, and there's something great about that. All the Bennet sisters feel real, but Elizabeth especially is so multifaceted. I think Beatrice from Much Ado About Nothing is the only comparison in this era to Elizabeth's wit.
And to be a deep, an old soul, a serious person, she draws the parallel to her parents, to Elizabeth's parents, who have this kind of unhappy marriage. The father's checked out, the mother is a lunatic, and she attributes this unhappy marriage to just giving in to passion, not disciplining yourself. She writes, her father, this is Elizabeth's father, the parents, captivated by youth and beauty, and that appearance of good humor which youth and beauty generally give, had married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal mind had very early in their marriage put an end to all real affection for her. Respect, esteem, and confidence had vanished forever, and all his views of domestic happiness were overthrown. To his wife he was very little otherwise indebted than as her ignorance and folly had contributed to his amusement. It's a pretty harsh burn. This is not the sort of happiness which a man would in general wish to owe to his wife.
So I think this is Jane Austen's answer to the man who says, oh, fiction isn't for me. Who cares about love? That's a woman's thing to worry about. Really? I mean, look what a mess this man has made of his life because of it.
This section right here is so bizarre. So Mr. Bennet being superficial when marrying is seen as a message to men who aren't going to read the book anyway? Like, what? This is so goddamn stupid. No, it exists to illustrate one direction marriage can take if you aren't passionate and aren't virtuous enough. It establishes the stakes at play if one compromises happiness for immediate pleasure or comfort. It exists as a destination for Wickham, where he'll go eventually, who is forced to marry Lydia by Darcy to save the Bennet family from public ruination. It exists as a destination for Elizabeth if she chose to marry Mr. Collins. It's partially why Mr. Bennet understands that Elizabeth could never marry Mr. Collins, even though it would benefit the entire family, because she would not be happy. She would be as miserable as he is now, married to Mrs. Bennet. And it provides a contrast for Elizabeth and Darcy, who form a relationship based on mutual respect despite their initial misgivings. Austen, and I cannot emphasize this enough, did not give a fuck what a man from a century later might think about her book. She was writing her book for her era.
He now is about to lose his family. They are all going to suffer poverty after him. He's suffering, and he's with a woman he doesn't respect or love, really.
Right.
And it was all his doing by thinking he was too good to think about relationships, to think about love, to think about morality. I mean, he's indifferent, and now he's suffering for it.
Mr. Bennet's family is going to risk facing poverty because he doesn't have a son. That's no one's fault. Blame genetics. It's not a moral failing he didn't get a boy. If anything, that's a critique on society, especially considering how Mr. Bennet praises Elizabeth for her wit. He is proud of Elizabeth throughout the entire story. Notice how at no point do these two people ever discuss how Elizabeth's sarcasm is a trait she gets from her father. He's the one who introduces the family to Bingley, who invites the Bingleys over. He is flawed, yeah, he has grown cynical in his age, but this is not framed as some moral lesson for the reader. Rather, and this is the tough part for you guys to understand, he's just a guy who exists in society. He is shaped by society's expectations as well as his own personal passions and unfulfilled passions. Yet these two are acting like this is a message for men who don't want to read these novels anyway, so who gives a fuck, Even though the men in Austen's era were precisely the people who would read such novels. Just because we read this today and not this now, does not mean they did back then.
Why does the book endure? Why? I mean, it seems to be such an affront to modernity. It seems like all the kind of modern, maybe feminist.
Yeah.
Why on earth do people still read this?
Knowles here says that the book is an affront to modernity. That's against feminism as a way to praise the work. But, explain yourself. I want you to explain how it is. Knowles will not explain. Is because the women have to marry, that's a top priority for them? Is that anti-feminist? You see, feminism I always thought was about women choosing what they wanted. And the work does not frame your compulsion to marry as a positive, or negative for that matter. It's just a thing that exists in society. Again, Austen's a neoclassicist. She believed in the story focusing on our role in reality. But that does not mean anyone has to be happy about it. See, while Knowles says it's anti-feminist, I disagree. Elizabeth Bennet is a character who stands up to Lady Catherine, stands up to Mr. Wickham, stands up to Mr. Collins, to the world and all of its expectations, and tells them all she'll do her own thing. She chooses marriage on her specific terms, not the expectations of society or its representatives. Knowles will not explain what's anti-feminist about this book. But then again, he understands the book as well as a stoned high school student who fell asleep during one of the adaptations and half remembers the actor who played Mr. Darcy.
It's a brilliant question, because the question is, right, why would women, and women love this book, people love this book, women love this book, and why would we love a book that's pre-suffrage, right, pre-feminism, pre-equality, pre-all these things? And I think the answer is, because while we have gained so much in modern life, women have gained so much, we also recognize that there are things we have lost.
Jesus Christ, Shrier, what the fuck are you talking about? No, this novel is not a sign we've lost something. What did women lose exactly? A restrictive caste system that values them as an economic asset, a byproduct?
We recognize that Darcy, if he exists, would never marry her today. He would just string her on forever. And that's the recognition. That's what we're missing. That's what women don't have today. And this novel is a first glimpse at how to get there, and a good reminder of what was, that we shouldn't be so quick to give up.
Shrier seems to be completely misunderstanding the text. She does not get Darcy at all. She says if Darcy existed today, he would string Elizabeth along. But that sounds vastly like another character who you refuse to name. Wickham. That's the bad guy of the story. Not the good guy of the story, the bad... Do I have to explain this to you like you're fucking four? At the end of the book, exactly 2 women are happy. Jane and Elizabeth. And that's because they found happiness on their terms. The book itself shows almost every single woman who's involved with the system is either moderately disappointed with life or miserable, and there's no middle ground outside of Elizabeth and Jane. This transitions into a long diatribe about how women aren't in STEM, and that's reflective of some desire women have. I want to cut down the bullshit to focus on this one core part, because I think it kind of gives away the whole idea behind this rant in miniature.
And they don't, because women actually have preferences. And you can belittle their preferences. You can tell them they all need to be in STEM, they all need to be coding. But actually, there are things women prefer. Not every woman wants to be Jeff Bezos, right? For some reason, right? Every woman is being chastised. We need to lean in more. Stop spending time with your children. Well, women actually have things that they prefer. And they aren't necessarily what men prefer, and that's fine.
This is typical conservative talking points, but it's being applied, again, to Pride and Prejudice. What does this have to do with Pride and Prejudice? You see, I missed the part in the book where Elizabeth turns to the reader and says, I really want children. Children of the future and amazing. I can't wait to be pregnant and barefoot. Shrier is desperate to connect reproductive ability to womanhood. It's what she does in her book she's trying to sell, after all. She wants you to stop focusing on your career and start focusing on marriage, start focusing on making babies, producing them. But of course, the problem is, Elizabeth Bennet, by the standards of her time, rejects tradition. She is not consumed by a drive to be married, nor does she care about children. She just wants what she wants in her own terms. She wants to read, she wants to learn, she wants to educate herself. She is ambitious, and that ambition is respected by Darcy. You have to read the book with blindfolds on. If you pretend that the point of Pride and Prejudice is to keep your legs shut until marriage, then start pumping out kids. Also, notice one core character they never examine in his whole analysis, his whole video so far, they've kind of neglected. Darcy. Yeah, all this talk about what women should do and treating Darcy like some idealized man, when Darcy's character, Darcy's behavior, his actions, his own flaws, they're never discussed.
I have not that talent which some possess of conversing easily with strangers.
He's half the fucking title, and they never talk about him. They talk about Elizabeth holding herself back for Darcy, but forget that never fucking happens in the book. Elizabeth doesn't restrain herself for Darcy. Darcy earns Elizabeth's respect. Darcy proves Elizabeth's prejudice is wrong because he overcomes his pride. Darcy is in the wrong in the book, and he changes for her. And that fact that he changes for her allows her to change for him.
It even strikes me that one's prejudice approaching the book, which is that this will be some frivolous, I mean, men don't like reading novels anyway, but there really won't be much of value to it. By the end, even the prejudice of the reader is changed because you realize you're dealing with a work in a way of moral philosophy, and certainly a work of deep gravity and probing of human nature.
This video exists to sell the book as useful tool to men. It's a useful tool for those who want to sell propaganda to a generation. This is not an analysis of a great work of literature. This doesn't sell you on the work. They barely explain the conflict of the book. Jane is barely mentioned, and she's one of the first characters introduced to the story. They don't mention Mr. Bingley almost at all. They don't mention Wickham. They don't mention what Lydia's going through. They just mention the moral pinings for their audience. And what is that? To reinforce traditional femininity. But the problem is, the very act of this novel existing is a rejection of that. Jane Austen had to fight to get this book written. They talk about women not wanting to focus on their careers. Jane Austen never married. Jane Austen never had kids. She died in her 40s, childless. Her ambitions were to become a writer. This entire podcast video is an affront to everything Jane Austen was. And the fact is, Jane Austen did believe in the good of society. In many respects, it shouldn't be that difficult for a conservative interpretation of her work to exist. But to interpret it through that lens, you actually have to read the book. You actually have to understand what you're talking about. And Knowles and Shrier demonstrate time and time again, they are not qualified to discuss this. They're not qualified to discuss any of Jane Austen's works. Because if you read the rest of her body of work, you soon realize how out of their depths they are. Imagine employing this with Northanger Abbey. Maybe that's why they never read another Jane Austen book, because outside of Pride and Prejudice, they can't figure out the plot based on the movie adaptation all so easily. But again, this is PragerU. What do you expect? Them to actually read the books they're reading about?
I think so. I think every man out there who, maybe didn't like it in high school should give it another shot, and every woman should read it for the tremendous pleasure of it.
If for no other reason that it will give us finally some glimpse into the absolutely inscrutable female psyche, which is practically very useful.
Yes.